Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Shuyuan Zhang will defend the academic thesis entitled Universal Rights, Local Realities, Freedom of Expression in Asian States Discourse and Practice. And I welcome everyone present here in this beautiful aula and also everyone who is participating online in this academic ceremony. Dear candidates, may I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear Pro-Rector, members of the committee, dear friends, colleagues, and families online too. Over the next 15 minutes, I will present a summary of my doctoral research titled Universal Rights, Local Realities, Freedom of Expression in Asian States Discourse and Practice. When I speak of universal rights, I refer to one of the core principles of the human rights, universality, the idea that all human beings, simply by being human, are entitled to these rights everywhere. To the contrary, local realities refer to the ways these rights are interpreted, adapted, or contested within specific cultural, political, and social contexts. My research explores this very tension, using freedom of expression as a lens. It looks at both what states say, their discourse, and what they do, their practice. To guide you through this presentation, I have structured it into 4 main parts. First, why? I will explain the background of this research. Second, what? I will introduce the main research questions and objectives. Third, how? I will outline the methodology and structure of this research. Finally, findings and further reflections. Why this research? The starting point of this research comes from a long-standing tension at the heart of the human rights system, the tension between universal principles and particular contexts. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by 48 states, marked a historic moment after World War II. It declared that all human beings are entitled to fundamental rights, regardless of culture, nation, or belief. Fast forward to 1993, at the Second World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, 171 states once again reaffirmed the universality of human rights through the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action. At the conference, however, deep tensions on universality and the particularity of human rights emerged. Several Asian states argued that cultural, historical, and religious particularities must be taken into account when applying human rights norms. That position had already been clearly expressed a few months earlier in the Bangkok Declaration, adopted at the Regional Meeting for Asia. The Bangkok Declaration, signed by 34 Asian states, was widely seen as a collective regional voice, one that stressed national sovereignty, non-interference, and the importance of economic, social, and cultural rights. Alongside what later became known as the Asian values debate. Traces of this debate also made their way into the Vienna Declaration itself. Paragraph 5 is a clear example. While it affirms universality, but it also adds, when protecting and promoting human rights, I quote, the significance of national and regional particularities and the various historical, cultural, and religious backgrounds must be borne in mind, end quote. This shows that the debate between universality and particularity is at the very core of international human rights system. At the same time, we shall also notice this debate goes beyond the Asian values argument. Many countries, especially those not involved in drafting the very early international instruments, have long questioned whether the human rights system itself reflects Western historical and moral assumptions. So the debate is not only about Asia, it's a much broader global conversation. This research is trying to answer the question against this background, that is, how do Asian states articulate the universality and particularity of human rights, both in what they say and in what they do, especially when it comes to freedom of expression. From that question, this research has two main aims. First, to identify and analyze the patterns, how these states speak about and apply human rights norms. And the second, to contribute to the broader debate on human rights universalism and particularism. Now you might wonder, why look at both discourse and implementation? It sounds like they can both as a standalone PhD research. Because what states say and what they do don't always match. Imagine some states can affirm human rights very loud in international forums, however they do different at home. And some states can say, no, we reject these human rights, but actually they're doing something good in practice. It could happen. So that's why this research looks at both to review the gaps, the consistency and the inconsistency, and the strategy of the states take when engaging with human rights norms. Let's now turn to the methodology, how this research was designed and conducted. This study combines both empirical and doctrinal research. It began with theory, moved into case studies, and returned to theory at the end. The research adopts a comparative approach. It focuses on Singapore, Malaysia, India, and the Philippines. This country was selected because they represent contrasting positions in the debate. In the 1990s, Singapore and Malaysia, they are two of the main advocates of the Asian values argument. While India and the Philippines are often seen as democracies that affirm human rights norms very much, at least in the international forums. Together, they form two comparative pairs that illustrate different ways states engage with human rights universality. The study examined both discourse and implementation, as we said earlier. By discourse, I mean the language and narrative states use to frame and justify their interpretation of human rights. To study this, I analyzed, first, the state's statement in the United Nations General Assembly, and second, the draft resolutions they sponsored or co-sponsored. Then I narrowed the focus to their discourse on freedom of expression, examining submissions and dialogues under the Universal Periodical Review. This moves from broader rhetoric to concrete positions on specific rights. For implementation, I examined how states operationalize freedom of expression within their domestic system. Through, first, constitutional approach, including the text and jurisprudence, and legislations governing speech, particularly in three areas: contempt of court, defamation, and online speech regulation. These areas were chosen because the weight of the values they carry different. And online speech regulation can tell us what is a recent trend in these countries' legislations on freedom of expression. Based on the findings from the country studies, this research developed a typology of four modes of engagement with human rights universality: rejection, contestation, dilution, and denial. These modes apply to both discourse and implementation. Now, even though this framework is derived from 4 Asian states, it's not region-specific or country-specific as such. It's meant to be a transferable tool. Something can help us analyze how any states engage with human rights more generally. Let me now briefly walk you through each of these 4 modes with examples from my research. First, rejection. This is when a state openly dismisses certain human rights norms as illegitimate or irrelevant, basically saying these norms do not apply to us. A clear example in my research is Singapore. In terms of implementation, Singapore has long adhered to the so-called Four Walls Doctrine, meaning the courts interpret rights purely within the text of the national constitution and refuse to refer to any international or foreign instruments. Further, Singapore's courts have also explicitly refused to apply tests of reasonableness or proportionality when reviewing the restrictions on free speech. Now come to contestation. Here, a state engages with human rights but promotes alternative interpretations, often based on ideas like cultural, community, or social responsibility, without rejecting human rights outright. Malaysia is a good example here. In implementation, Malaysia initially took a very similar path to Singapore, relying on the Four Walls Doctrine and rejecting proportionality review. But in recent years, we've seen some shifts in the courts. A few cases now refer to international instruments and apply reasonableness test, although this change is still uneven and inconsistent. In its discourse, Malaysia tends to emphasize cultural and moral values, things like family, cultural diversity, tolerance, and responsibility. This reflects more of a contestational stance, but still contains elements of rejection, especially when freedom of expression is portrayed as a potential threat to social harmony. Third, dilution. This happens when a state formally endorses human rights, but then narrows their scope by adding conditions, qualifiers, exceptions, or broad limitations, which effectively weakens their universality. India represents a mix of contestation and dilution. While it fully recognizes human rights in international forums, but at the same time it signed the Bangkok Declaration, and frequently stresses human responsibilities in international discussions too. At home, India's constitution aligns with universal human rights principles if we take a look at their freedom of expression protection. However, the courts also invoke duties and responsibilities, or when certain laws also impose very broad limits on free speech. So we can see how universality becomes diluted in practice. Finally, denial. This mode looks quite different. Here, a state strongly affirms universality in its official rhetoric, but denies any wrongdoing or refuses to recognize violations, often to protect its international legitimacy. The Philippines fits this pattern very clearly. It continues to affirm its commitment to universal human rights in international forums, yet denies allegations of human rights violations, especially since 2016. So, rhetorically universal, but in practice deeply defensive. In short, these four modes, rejection, contestation, dilution, and denial, capture the different ways states engage with human rights universality, go beyond the banal discussion only for or against human rights. So beyond the topology itself, what else do we find? If we look at the discourse, we find that the outright rejection of universality is actually quite real nowadays. What we see more often are forms of contestation and dilution, states questioning how universality applies or reshaping it to fit their context. That could mean two things. Maybe there is a growing acceptance of the international human rights framework, or maybe there is just less willingness to engage in the real debate. In implementation, we find the inter-branch dynamics, the relationships between the executive, legislature, and the judiciary reveal some interesting internal splits. This shows that the state isn't a single, unified actor when it comes to human rights. Instead, we see different political, legal, and parliamentary cultures pulling in different directions. When we compare discourse and implementation, another pattern emerges. Engagement with the United Nations human rights system often remains superficial or disconnected, at least, from practice. This shows why we need to go beyond looking at who ratified which treaty and instead focus on what is actually happening in practice. Now, if we revisit the famous Asian values argument, the question is, do genuine commonalities actually exist? Maybe, but we should be cautious. Some so-called Asian values might not reflect what people in these societies truly believe. Instead, they often serve political purposes. For example, after 2016, the Philippine government dismissed all allegations of human rights violations, not because the public denied them, but because the government wanted to control the narrative. This is a clear case where the state's rhetoric does not match the reality. Still, across all four countries I studied, there are some interesting overlaps. Each country, at least one time in international forums, the United Nations, have sponsored or co-sponsored draft resolutions on human responsibility alongside human rights. Whether this complements or contradicts human rights ideas is up for further debate and the development of theories, but the shared emphasis suggests a possible regional thread worth thinking about. Finally, this study argued that human rights universality is best realized through prudential particularism, which sounds a bit complicated, but the idea is prudential particularism is about recognizing context when applying moral and legal principles. It's a flexible, case-by-case approach that accepts universal human rights as a foundation, but insists that implementation must adapt to local realities if it is to be truly effective and just. So a very rigid adherence to abstract rules might sound principled, but in practice can lead to unfair or impractical outcomes. Hence, the prudential particularism serves as a corrective mechanism. A good example is how the Indian courts have interpreted what constitutes speech as such, and how the proportionality test applied in different cases. These judicial interpretations illustrate the element of prudential particularism, an effort to adapt universal principles to specific contexts. But this also raises a deeper theoretical question. When courts apply proportionality, are they truly reflecting local sensitivities or social contexts, or are they primarily expressing judicial perspective and institutional preferences? This research opens a door to deeper reflection on how prudential particularism works in practice, perhaps requiring new elements that shape both procedure and substance, and how theory and jurisprudence can better inform each other in realizing human rights universality. To conclude, this research does not claim to offer final answers, but seeks to deepen the conversation on how universality is negotiated, contested, and reimagined across different contexts. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And now you will have the opportunity to defend your thesis against the objections to be put forward by the members of the committee here present. And the opposition will be opened by Professor Broderick. Professor Broderick holds the UNESCO Chair in Human Rights and Peace at our university, and she is also the chair of the assessment committee.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Thank you, candidate. Dear candidate, thank you for your wonderfully clear presentation and for your fascinating book, from which I gained many new insights into an age-old debate on universalism versus particularism. But we're not here only for compliments, but rather to see you defend your thesis. So let me proceed to my question. My opening question consists of two sub-questions. In your thesis, you frame clashes between communitarian logics, on the one hand, in the Asian context, and then human rights universalism in the UN context, as disputes or clashes between interpretive authorities. Now, the statement itself, I would agree with. What I'm missing a little bit in the thesis is an overall definition of what interpretive authority means within your thesis. So if you could reflect on that now, how would you define interpretive authority? Is it primarily institutional, for example? Is it epistemic? Or is it more discursive? That was my first sub-question. My second question is, to what extent can we ever separate, as I perceive you do in your thesis, substantive disagreements over rights from contests over the authority of a body to interpret those rights? Now, what I mean by that is the act of interpretation itself not a contest for authority? And through interpreting, do bodies not re-establish their authority?
Thank you very much for your question, highly esteemed opponent, I think, and also compliment. I think your two sub-questions are all around the very key concept of interpretive authority. I think it's a very interesting and provoking question. I do admit I didn't really dig very deep and establish a concept as such. But I do mention, as you said, the logic and the values underlying communitarianism and the localism and also security-oriented perspectives can have some inherent clash with underlying values of human rights. So first of all, to ultimately answer your question on interpretive authority, I would love to clarify what do I mean by this statement first. So what do I mean is, if we go through scholar discussions on cultural relativism versus universalism, we will always see the scholar debate is focused on Asian values argument and how does it bring challenge to the universality of human rights. But my argument is a bit different from this position in my thesis is I do think the underlying values of communitarian and the security-oriented perspective have some inherent clash with the underlying value of human rights. Because human rights stress individualism and stress human dignity and the individual rights as such. But if we are concerning national security, if we're concerning the community values, it's not in such paradigm of when the human rights was born. So when Asian values could emphasize this aspect, I do think it also exists in all the societies when the core values of the society has been touched upon and the core values is relevant to what we are saying just now. So this is first, the meaning of the statement I made there. And the second, the interpretive authority. I do think there can be multiple interpretive authority because it really depends on how we define it. We can say, okay, in international human rights system, probably the United Nations treaty body should be regarded as interpretive authority. When they can argue, okay, they have the function established in the treaty itself, so they have the authority, even it's not legally binding as such, but they have the authority to interpret the international human rights norms. As we can see in General Comment number 34 on freedom of expression. But in national context, the government will say, no, we have the principle of sovereignty, and why we apply the international norms, we are actually the interpretive authority. So by that, I do not limit it into any single actor in my thesis, but I do acknowledge states or different actors or people can view themselves as the interpretive authority, especially in the discourse. We can see when the states have the appetite for real debates, they will claim, no, the interpretation should be subject to our sovereignty. So I am the authority to interpret it. But when the states probably do not have the real appetite for debate, they will admit, oh, I do acknowledge the universality of human rights. Then they do acknowledge the role of the international human rights system in interpreting the human rights treaties as such, but they actually did something different in their country. So I was wondering, like when we are defining or when we are pondering over the concept of interpretive authority, which references, which evidence are we based our argument on? If you're looking at the discourse, probably you have different conclusions from if you're looking at the implementation. So I also think scholars can also have kind of interpretive authority if it's a discussion on the theories as such. So I do think I don't limit the interpretive authority to a single actor in my thesis, but I do acknowledge different actors' perspective in analyzing this clash or analyzing this debate. I hope this answers your question.
That does, and you answered the second sub-question within the first sub-question.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Now the opposition will be continued by Professor Koen Lemmens. Professor Lemmens is a professor of European and International Human Rights Law, Constitutional Law and Media Law at the University of Leuven, and he's also a member of the Assessment Committee. And I would like to welcome you very much to Maastricht University today. Very good to have you here. I think it's also very much a confirmation of the close ties of friendship between our two faculties. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Prorector. Dear candidate, I would like to start first by congratulating you on your work. I found the topic really topical. It's original, seen from a traditional Western European perspective. I found it very well structured, as is your presentation, and very insightful. If it were in Belgium, I would go on. I suppose that Belgian academic values are much more Baroque than the Netherlands, and even if this is Maastricht, it's still the Netherlands, so we have to go immediately to the question and be very efficient. In the choice of topics, whereby you decided to compare the 4 countries, you mentioned them also in the presentation. You took topics such as contempt of court, online regulation, online speech regulation. Defamation, I could perfectly understand. But the point is, your work is on values. And my question is essentially like Professor Budrick's, a little bit into two dimensions. First, are they the best choices you could make? Because they seem to be contempt of court, online regulation, they seem to be a little bit almost value neutral, right? I would rather think of topics such as blasphemy, pornography, maybe hate speech, maybe promotion of some medical practices, and so on and so forth. So how did you decide to go for the ones you opted for? That's part one of the question. Part two, would you think that by choosing one of the topics I just mentioned, that would alter your conclusions and your findings of your work?
Thank you very much for your compliment and the questions, highly esteemed opponent. Yes, I did spend a lot of time myself even pondering over what choice should I make for the specific area under the freedom expression to see the implementation. But I do think I made a good choice. So why contempt of court, defamation, and online speech regulation? Given you already give credit, you agree defamation is an okay choice, so I will focus on my answer to online speech regulation and contempt of court. I do admit contempt of court is not such a value-laden topic. It sounds more like technical, more value-neutral, and you have a standard there, and you have the heritage from the common law system. And given that all the 4 countries under analysis, they all have the history of colonization. So they do have this common law practice in their own jurisdictions too. But the reason I choose these 3 areas, first of all, from a general perspective, is I want to have the progression from something like neutral, more value neutral, to something more value laden to defamation. And then we have the online speech regulation, which give us a chance to see the recent change or tendency of these states take to regulate the online speech, because it's kind of new. I mean, even we already have the digital platform a long time ago. So I treat online speech regulation more as agency, where we can see the newest development on the restriction of freedom of expression by these 4 states. And I do think this does a job. So for the contempt of court, I want to go back to this is, even it sounds value neutral, but I do find something interesting. So in Singapore and Malaysia, you find a standard to identify if there is contempt of court is different from the standard applied by the India and the Philippines. So for the Malaysia and the Singapore, they use more the inherent tendency test, which means if the court think there is inherent tendency that this statement could jeopardize the justice, the confidence in the people's confidence in the justice system as such, they will deem there is a contempt of court. But in India and the Philippines, they refuse to use this standard because they think if I use this standard, it will be too much. If the court think, okay, today you say something, I think it has a tendency to jeopardize, then I could say, okay, you should not say this. So this is already a restriction of freedom of expression. But instead, they use the standard is the real risk. So they see what is caused by that, and they deem if there is a real contempt of court or not. So I do think when you see this from the finding, you see even this kind of the technical area of restriction of freedom of expression, but they still have been implemented differently in these countries. They have been influenced by value, even it's not so obvious as such. So I do think this progression of the topic I choose in freedom of expression as a match to my research aim and question. And also answering why I was not choosing blasphemy, obscenity. I do think they are very interesting topic. But the question is, take blasphemy as an example. You do find the laws regulating blasphemy in India and also in Malaysia, but you do not find such hard law regulating it in Singapore and the Philippines. they are more in soft law and moral guidelines. So from a methodology perspective, it's kind of hard for me to do a consistent and comparable studies of these 4 jurisdictions when the form and the substance and even the existence of these regulations have differed so much in the 4 jurisdictions. And your question, if I alter the subject, will the finding be different or not? I think we would definitely find something different. Because like blasphemy, for example, you also, I mean, it's a topic relevant to freedom of religion too. And obscenity, it's also, it's relevant to gender equality, it's relevant to consent, it's relevant to a lot of other topics, which is also another reason why I don't choose to focus on them, because it's kind of like a trade-off I intentionally make for my research. I would love to do research in it, but I only choose these areas for the legislation part, right? For the constitutional approach part, I even didn't really limit the research subject to the specific areas. I look at what is the constitutional approach to freedom of expression per se. So I can't do that much, including the concerns in freedom of religion and more broadly other topics in my research. So I did this trade-off in order to fit the research lens and the capacity. So yes, it definitely will alter the finding because I will find something more interesting. So something regarding the religious freedom, something regarding the gender equality there, something regarding more broadly the moral values discussion. But I do think the findings so far has also satisfied the research aim. I hope this answers your question.
Are you satisfied with the answer?
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. In that case, the opposition will be continued by Professor Flinterman. Professor Flinterman is Emeritus Professor of International Law at our university, and he's also the Secretary to the Degree Committee.
Dank u, meneer de rector. Madam Candidate, I've read your PhD dissertation with great interest. And why? Because it brought me back to the early 90s, when I had the privilege of being the chair of the Netherlands government delegation to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights in 1993, and the chair of the government delegation to the Second World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna in 1993, to which you are making many references in your book. I was very pleased. At that time, you remember the discussion about the Asian values was at its peak. And many Western states especially feared that giving in to the Asian states would undermine the universality of human rights. It took the first week of negotiating, intense negotiations on 2 sentences, and you have already referred to one, paragraph 5 of the Declaration of Vienna, the final Declaration of Vienna. I would like to read those 2 paragraphs. And the first one is that the universal nature of these rights and freedoms is beyond question. And that's paragraph 1. Paragraph 5 is, while the significance of national and regional particularities and various historical, cultural, and religious backgrounds must be borne in mind, it's a duty of states, regardless of their political, economic, and cultural systems, to promote and protect all human rights and fundamental freedoms. And that formula, used at the time, opened the way to successful negotiations on the rest of the 99 paragraphs accounting text. I therefore couldn't agree more with your overall conclusion, which says that this thesis argues that adopting and applying prudential particularism in human rights is inevitable, which is also reflected in proposition number 8 of your propositions. And my question to you would be, Madam Candidate, suppose that next year the 3rd World Conference on Human Rights would take place, and you would have the chair in participating in that conference. Would you use a different formula than used in 1993 in trying to reconcile the notions of universalism and particularism in the field of human rights? Or would you say, well, the time has come, also in light of your analysis of these questions in your book, focusing on 4 Asian countries, that the time has come to reconfirm Vienna and to open the way to international cooperation, further international cooperation in the field of protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms? I'm waiting for your answer.
Thank you very much for your question, highly esteemed opponent. Well, I think I'm not a diplomat, so first of all, I don't think I have the capacity to really do better than the VDPA in 1993. But okay, I will try my best to give my view here. So first of all, the paragraph 5 you referred to in the Vienna Declaration back in 1993, I think is a big success. But because the result of that conference is you have 171 states endorsed this declaration. Compared to the 48 states, that number, which voted in favor for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights back in 1948, it's a huge success and improvement. I think we should give credit to that first. But second, I found this very interesting because I compare the text of Bangkok Declaration and the text of paragraph 5 of Vienna Declaration. I do find something interesting. So in the Bangkok Declaration, it's not only, the Asian states are not only claiming we should take into consideration the particularities of the culture of the society into the interpretation and application of human rights norms as stipulated in the Vienna Declaration, but further they claim even in the make of the norms. So I do think the Vienna, I don't know the story behind the Vienna Declaration, how the negotiation was taking place. But I do think great efforts was made to gain compromise between states and to have the universality as a principle to be held in the declaration when you phrase it as it's the particularities only be taken into account in the application of human rights, not the make of the norms themselves. Because I do think you have different levels of contestation there. So this is the second thing I want to share. And you mentioned prudential particularism, and you mentioned what if there's another World Conference on Human Rights is going to take place, how we're going to deal with all the different ideas and the arguments held by the Global South, or the Asian countries, or the decolonized countries, or Third World, or let's phrase whatever we want. But when every country is taking place, well, their culture can be clashed. My answer is actually related to another proposition in my thesis, which is proposition 2. So it was stated something relevant to human responsibility. So I want to take human responsibility as an example here. I'm not confident to say I would reach another better consensus as has been done in the Vienna Declaration, as in such broad, general, common way. But I do think, okay, if we have a chance to make a treaty, so you have more concrete provisions, or you have more concrete contents which can use to reflect different values and cultures of these states, I will say human responsibilities alongside human rights can be an interesting topic. And if we define the human responsibilities well, not let the state to use it as justification to restrict freedom of expression, for example, but to define the subject of the human responsibility, to define the substance and the procedure alongside. For example, we can have the human responsibility to the environment. We can have the human responsibility to the next generation. Then probably human responsibility also have a way to further devote to the idea of human rights, but probably not as a way argued by the Asian states. So I do think yeah, please.
Thank you for your answer. It would be very nice if you would have the opportunity to continue the discussion for some time, but only a short question. You refer to the Vienna Declaration as a sort of compromise formula. I'm inclined to say that's not so much a compromise formula, but the formula used was the recognition by the whole international community that universalism can never mean uniformity. It has always to be seen in the context, in the perspectives of the different cultures and religions in this world. Would you agree?
I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The opposition will now be continued by Professor Komans. Professor Komans is Emeritus Professor at the UNESCO Chair of Human Rights and Peace. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, let me start by saying that your thesis is indeed a solid, rich, and very readable piece of work. I've read it with great interest and appreciation. My question aims at challenging you a bit on the notion of Asian values. In the introduction of your book, you present an overview of the discussion in the literature about Asian values. In addition, on page 59, you argue that at the level of law and compliance, it is essential to consider culture as advocated by prudential particularism. Culture reflects certain values. And that raises the question, whose values are we talking about? The values of those who are in power, or those whose rights have been curtailed by the authorities and the courts, such as a journalist or a protester in the street? And who determines and identifies these values? Put differently, how do Asian values, as you describe them in your book, relate to the values of the victims who have experienced violations of their universal right to freedom of expression? Universality is also about how right holders experience the enjoyment of rights. How are these individual experiences related to cultural values, in particular Asian values? In other words, should this individual dimension be included in the debate about universalism and particularism? And this relates to understanding the notion of the dynamics of universality. In your view, is this a top-down process, or is there room for a bottom-up approach, incorporating the views at the grassroots level, including those of the victims? I'm looking forward to your answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your compliments and the question, highly esteemed opponent. Wow, this is a very interesting and a very classic question if anyone is researching into this topic. First of all, I do acknowledge my work is not anthropological work, so I do not research per se through interviews, questionnaire to see what is the real values existing in that society. And I also very much acknowledge that the values argued or referred to by the governments, the allies of governments, do not necessarily reflect the genuine values on the ground. And I think you raised a very interesting point is how do these victims of human rights violations experience all of these and what is values of them? And how can this be reflected in the values when we are arguing, okay, this is the values of this society or this culture as such? I want to share a lot of things on this topic, but let me try to get a bit more logic and structured. I want to start answering this question by giving one example. So I already mentioned the Philippines example in my presentation. Is like after 2016, the government has basically denied all the allegations of human rights violations in the international forums. While we do know there are a lot of things going on after 2016 because there's anti-drug war. So this is a very, very straightforward example to see, okay, the values referred to the government can be very different from the values cherished by the people living there. And also if we are going to read the news today or recently around the world, you will find, for example, the freedom of expression. Why it's universal? Probably it's not depends on the values referred to by the government or the universality when we see, okay, there are different legal models, adopted by the EU, adopted by the America, adopted by the international organizations and also Asian countries in my research, I do think the universality and different values existing in the fact that the government, no matter where, like Asian or West, they are repressing freedom of expression and peoples are fighting for it. So there are protests, there are government repressing this protest. So I think this is a vivid example itself to prove the universal values underlying the freedom of expression, not the fact that the government is refusing this idea, or they are referring to some values to justify their actions or restrictions on freedom of expression. And another example I want to give is, I want to share a very small perspective, but I do think it's so relevant to this question, is I did some research in Nepal this summer. So we do the research on transitional justice there, and we do interviews with victims and survivors from the 1996 to 2006, the internal armed conflict. So when I ask these victims and survivors what the repression you need, they give us a very different answer from the perspective of a scholar or human rights lawyer would imagine. For them, accountability is not the most important thing, but we will probably be shocked to find, of course, there need to be accountability, but for them, they want a social support as the first most important thing. So I do think if you ask the individual, what do you need? You will probably get a very dispersed, contextualized answer from what we are usually say, okay, the universal principle should be held. So I do think it opens a more provoking debate on how do we move forward. When we face a different challenge, like the climate change, the challenge with AI, and also different things happening around the world, of course, we want to insist on universality of human rights, because I also agree with that from the analysis I've done it at the moral level and the value level. There is human dignity. There is shared values and needs we want to have. But how do we move forward? So how do we balance the rights-based system and the needs-based system, probably, which is more problematic? Pragmatic on the ground. So this would be my answer. I don't think it directly answers the question, but I think it's more like a discussion, what I have in my mind right now. Hope this answers your question.
But do you foresee a kind of process of universalizing the rights that you have used in your thesis, the freedom of expression? So what I mean is this bottom-up approach from at grassroots level moving upwards.
Wow, bottom-up approach. I did reflect on the question, which is at the end of my presentation, is if I'm arguing we should use prudential particularism while insisting on universality. But how are we going to do it, right? Because prudential particularism is just an idea, a concept. So as I explained before, I will say the proportionality has the element of prudential particularism when the Constitutional Court is reviewing the constitutionality, the validity of the legislations restricting freedom of expression and such. But it's still vague, because you can apply proportionality in such a different ways. There are also different elements, there are also different standards. And also, if we imagine it's a real court, there are judges making the decision. So can you ensure the judge is taking a bottom-up approach to reflect, okay, what is the real most important thing in this case, or they're more like, could be their like individual interpretation and preference too. So I do think if we want to take a bottom-up approach, like it needs to be designed and considered in many different levels and aspects, and both substance and procedural. Yeah. Thank you.
Now the opposition will be continued by Professor Garland. Professor Garland is Assistant Professor of Human Rights Law at the Faculty of Law of our university, and is also a member of the Assessment Committee.
Thank you. Dear candidate, first I'd like to compliment you on the excellent work you've done. Your thesis is thoughtful, well-structured, and rich in insights, and I did learn a lot from reading it. Now my role today is not only to compliment, but also to ask some questions, said opposition questions. So the thesis concludes or observes that all jurisdictions under study exhibit elements of cultural relativism when core values are perceived to be under threat, and shift toward universalist rhetoric when those values align with international norm. And this insight seems to me actually to be exportable to all the world, not only to the case studied. So my question first is this: is there any state that is genuinely and consistently universalist? Or should we understand all states as moving between universalism, rhetorically, and various forms of particularism, depending on the context? The second point I'd like to raise is, what if anything, actually, that would distinguish the Asian values approaches to human rights from other regional approaches, if we take into account the European Court of Human Rights and the margin of appreciation, which gives great weight to social interest when the margin is granted. The African Charter, which gives great duties and collective values into its legal framework in specific articles, which needs to be taken into account when interpreting rights. Or take even the United States, how they treat free speech as absolute, so the entire different way of dealing with freedom of expression in this sense. So all are different, and what, if anything, actually distinguish the Asian approach to human rights compared to these?
Thank you very much for your compliment and questions, highly esteemed opponents. These are also very interesting questions. I will start with your first question. So, first I have to say, I study these 4 jurisdictions, right? So I have some knowledge for other jurisdictions or other regions or other states, but probably I do not necessarily have the interpretive authority here in this expertise. So I would try my best to answer the questions. I do think from my case study, there is general trend that these countries stop labeling themselves as, okay, I'm taking the stance as cultural relativism, or I'm challenging the human rights universality directly. They're more, according to my research, they are more adopting the contestation and dilution as such. And in Philippines' case, it's kind of special. It adopts the denial strategy. I do not dig into what is the reasons behind. It's beyond my research scope, but I do raise a question there, which I think is provoking and it's worthwhile further research. Is this a sign showing the states are agreeing to universal human rights principles more? Is this a sign showing they participating more actively in the human rights system? I'm not sure. Probably it's a sign showing they have no real interest in participating in the debate anymore. Imagine what if I always say, okay, I want apple. And the answer is always, no, we only have orange. Sorry, it's a very, probably not a very appropriate example, huh? But then probably one day I just stop saying that I want an apple. I say I want an orange. Then I go back to buy some apple by myself in the grocery store. So that's the point. That's also why I extended the research into the implementation level, because I do want to see when these states decline their explicit argument for cultural relativism, what do they do at home? So I do find when the Singapore only mentioned human rights for 3 times between 2009 to 2025 in the United General Assembly debates, they are still applying 4 walls doctrine, and they're still rejecting the reasonableness test in reviewing the constitutionality of laws restricting freedom of expression. So to say, they did not really accept the universality, at least embodied in freedom of expression per se. For other jurisdictions, I do think also it's kind of relevant to my answers to Professor von Kuhlmann's question, is if we read the news worldwide, we do see there's different contestations or challenge to the international human rights system. So are these countries also taking a form of particularist? Are they challenging the universality in a probably a different form or similar form, as the Asian states argue? Perhaps. And every state, when it's also a question relevant to Professor Andrew Broderick's question is when they are challenging the human rights system, are they debating, okay, the interpretive authority should be us, the sovereignty should be us, and when the value of the security-oriented perspective have been challenged, is any society doing different? Probably no. They will still refer to national sovereignty. They will still say, okay, this is communal interest we want to protect, and they will prioritize this over human rights protection. So is this a form of universalist or it's a form of particularist? I would say from the perspective of my research, it can be a form of particularist. That's also why I use this terminology instead of mention Asian values argument in my thesis title or cultural relativism, because I do think this is a wider debate based on the universality and particularity of human rights. So I think it's also relevant to your second question. So is there anything really distinctive from Asian values argument from other regions? I definitely think if we can take a look at the real values there are definitely differences in between different regions around the world. But again, the limitation of my thesis is not anthropological study, so I didn't really look into the ground. I only look at the state's discourse and the implementation as such. But if we think about other examples, like the South Africa and the Colombia, because I also take a look at their constitutional court case. So you can see probably some courts, they're adopting very different interpretation tools and methodologies to protect the human rights. But is this a form of particularist, or does this show different values? I would say, I think it shows different values and histories and the culture behind. Because in South Africa's constitutional court study, case law study, you can see there's a lot of debates, discussions on the equality and non-discrimination as a principle. So, and the freedom of expression. You mentioned there's different models of the US, of the EU, and also the 4 Asian countries under analysis, they're all adopting different models. Now, which one is the real universalist one? I would say being universal is different from being absolute. So when the US is adopting the text, the constitutional text as, okay, freedom of expression is an absolute right, the international human rights system does say there are some qualifiers, there are some exceptions, and there are some limitations. And also the EU model apply proportionality to see if the restrictions is proper or not. So for me, again, I would say, well, in the dimension of law, at the level of positive law, there can be different models. But the underlying values, at the dimension of values, the values underlying human rights, underlying freedom of expression is universal, and is proven by all the examples happening around us nowadays in different countries, by people protesting for it, by people fighting for it when the government is reprising it. I hope this answers your question.
Does this still give rise to additional comments, esteemed opponent?
It did answer my question. Thank you, candidate.
Thank you.
I would like to allow Professor Broderick to raise a second question.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, I would like to return to the tension that you described between universalism and particularism, which lies at the heart of your thesis, and it also relates partly to the question or to your answer to Professor Kuhlmann's question. On page 26 of your thesis, and I quote, you argue that the universality of human rights serves as a check on the potential excesses of relativism. However, On the one hand, the legitimacy and the interpretive authority that we see in human rights law derives from universalism and consistency of interpretation, and we have the risk that applying prudential particularism, there will be a collapse into arbitrariness. Now, you mentioned proportionality as a potential normative human rights-based criterion that could potentially cure this arbitrariness. Are there any other normative human rights-based criteria that you could imagine could be applied in a situation where prudential particularism arises in order to preserve such legitimacy that I refer to? Could we also think of things like the core of human rights and the penumbra of human rights that the treaty bodies speak of? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, highly esteemed opponent. I think the paragraph you referred to is my description of the weak cultural relativism. So there's a difference between weak and strong cultural relativism. While the former admit the universality is still the principle to be upheld, but we can apply some cultural considerations implementing it, while the latter is treating culture as more as primary source to see if the norm is legitimate or not. To answer your question, I think yes, there is a real risk if we are going to apply prudential particularism, and perhaps it will become the reason or the excuse referred to by government to see, okay, we are actually looking into the context. That's why we're doing this, not because, this is our rhetoric.
You may briefly conclude your sentence or reply.
So at the level of positive law, I think principle of transparency and participation can also have a role there. At the level of values, I also argue the human rights universalism based on the collective democratic discussion can play a procedural role, and substantively, the logic based on human rights shared needs and wants and dignity can play a role there at the level of value. Hope this answers your question.
Shuyuan Zhang, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And I request that you and your company, both here and online, await the results of our deliberations and our return here in this room. Shuyuan Zhang. The degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taken into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Raimondo is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I now invite your supervisor to take the floor.
Please all rise. Please use the microphone.
Oh,
All right. So, do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law, and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Shuyuan Zhang, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
Please be seated.
Dear Shuyuan, dear colleagues, dear all, it is a great pleasure to deliver this laudation on the occasion of Shuyuan's successful defense of her dissertation. Shuyuan joined our university from the China University of Political Science and Law, where she earned a master's degree in civil and commercial law. She was selected for our PhD position through a highly competitive process, and right from the very first interview, she impressed me with her determination and clarity of purpose. Throughout her PhD, Shuyuan worked with remarkable discipline and positivity. She was very well organized, always open to feedback, and advanced her work consistently according to plan. Her energy, good humor, and reliability made supervising her an absolute pleasure. Outside academia, Shuyuan is a passionate runner. She even completed a half marathon here in Maastricht. She once joked that academics make good runners because both require perseverance in something boring and repetitive. A fine example of her dry humor and her balanced view of the ups and downs of academic life. Shuyuan, you have now reached the finish line of this race, and as all runners know, every finish line is also the starting line of a new race. On behalf of your supervisors and colleagues, I congratulate you wholeheartedly on this outstanding achievement and wish you every success in your future endeavors. Congratulations, Dr. Zhang.
Dear Dr. Zhang, also on behalf of Maastricht University and its Faculty of Law, many congratulations on the degree that you just acquired. You may know, I always say it's the highest degree we have available as a university. Many congratulations to you, to your supervisors, to all your family and friends, both present here in this auditorium and present online. And I can say that on behalf of our young doctor, there will be a reception at which colleagues and friends and family present here can congratulate the young doctor. That reception will take place right here in this building. What we are still going to do is to take the traditional photo of the young doctor together with her paronyms, together with her supervisors, with the committee, and with the beadle, and that we will do at the stairs of this building. I have already identified, I think, 2 professional photographers here on the second row who are very much allowed to join us for that photo taking. And when leaving this aula, I would like to ask everyone else to give priority to the cortege. And congratulations again. And with that, I officially close this academic ceremony.